Hello and welcome to the podcast where we're going to explore everything we can about game economy design, from the very basics of the core balance and game feel all the way through to commercial points where money starts taking a part of the game experience. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Raul. Raul, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hello. Thank you, Oscar. Well, my name is Raul. I'm an engineer by education in computer science and mathematics, and I work in games in game design, game production, in economic design for roughly 10 years in the beginning of my career. And then I transitioned to product management in the space of game development, but also in tech in general, which is what I'm currently doing, helping people out in all things product, startups, scale-ups, and stuff like that. But I also continue to work and assist other small game studios in all things related to game production, design, and stuff like that.
And I particularly, because I think product management is such an important part of the picture we're trying to paint, because as a product owner, I've been responsible for the success of the game. And there's a whole range of metrics that I'm interested in to show that we're on target. As a product owner, I've been in a fortunate or odd position, whatever it is, where you're there early on trying to decide what the success of this thing is likely to be, and then keeping it going once it goes live to be able to then develop that success and realize it. Is that your experience of what the product management role is all about?
Yes. I mean, it depends heavily on, as you mentioned, on the stage in which you join into the particular game project. Because the traditional view of product management is that you try to decide everything with metrics and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But when you have no thing live with users, it's like there are no metrics. So you need to design something. You need to have a keen sense of design. And also, in my experience, a lot of strategic input and insights in how you're going to make decisions. Because the way I frame it is that ideally, if you could calculate what the optimal outcome should be, you would do it. But sometimes you don't have the data to do it because there are no data, because the product is not live yet.
So many unknowns, aren't there? Yeah.
Or even if you have something live, for example, when you have a live game and you say, we want to introduce a new feature, and this feature, we wouldn't know necessarily beforehand how people are going to react to it. Then you need to have some other way to make decisions about that thing without having data. Actually, that's how I explain people a strategy. A strategy is a decision-making framework you have when you have no data. You need to have something.
Look at it. You're always looking for what data you can get, whether it's market general information or whether it's kind of like
exactly
qualitative testing, market testing.
And also, you crystallize it in a set of priorities. It's like you're going to prioritize this over that, or you're not going to cross these and these lines because you have some sort of a space of, as you mentioned, I think, some space of possibilities that you need to explore. And for some particular reasons, you say, we're going to focus on this particular space. We're not going to cross into this other space that may overlap with our competition or something that we don't want to necessarily engage with and stuff like that.
So where do you start this process then? So, is it you're looking at a product first, you're looking at audience first, you're looking at market gap? How do you look at that? How would you get started?
Yeah, you could start from any of those points, but usually when you have a new game idea, this usually comes with an hypothesis. And this hypothesis is somehow crystallized in the premise of the game. Yeah. When you say, for example, I don't know, this is Pokemon plus basketball plus something else.
Yeah, like a classic method.
I'm trying to remember because Frank Lantz describes League of Legends as Pokemon plus basketball plus something else.
Yeah.
Imagine.
I remember it. Yeah.
So remember, from a general point of view, before people knew the existence of League of Legends, and when you frame it like that, you say, okay, so we have these elements of mechanics and designs, and hence the gameplay that people are going to have, and also sometimes in the premise there are baked other elements which belong to either audience or timing or theme or any of those things. So you try to say, okay, when people receive this thing, people will somehow try to relate it to something else they already know. So you try to say, okay, is this like this game or like this other game? Are we going to attract people that are, for example, players of this particular MMO? Or is this more like for example, I try to imagine the premise when Rocket League started. So you have football and cars. We're going to attract people who likes football and cars. And it's like, yeah, but it can be like something in the middle because it's a very arcade-like game, and people that are very high end on either football or cars probably won't like it. And maybe there is a broader market of people that just like the mayhem that you're going to design into it. So you have like your thesis.
I do think that's one of the key kind of difficulties. So a lot of people have the idea of like, we'll take one principal idea, another principal idea, we'll smash them together, and the result will be better. That's not always the case. You've got to understand what the result is before you can define who it's going to be attracted to that unified concept.
And also people need to distinguish. I think this is one of the hardest things. That one thing is the premise or the elements of the premise which you're going to attract people to your game. And another one is why people are going to stay and engage long term with it. Because, for example, when you say Rocket League, you could say this is an intriguing premise and people that are going to be tickled by it are going to be attracted to it. And maybe when they see the mayhem that you get to display on the game and everything, they're going to stay with it. But the reason why people stay playing Rocket League is different, because when you go into the details of that particular game, for example, it's quite accessible to play, and you can be very early on just playing with the game and enjoying part of the mayhem. But it's very well crafted and designed, and you can get to have very specialized skills that you need to develop to become good at the game. And you have all kinds of elements for playing with other people and having a community around it. All those things, like when you go past the premise, it's all about the skill and the possibility of you being kind of a performer in the game, doing these amazing things. And for example, usually all multiplayer games in the end present some form of performance. Like you need to have some reason for people to become good at it, hopefully with other people, and so they can show it to other people. And usually you don't need to have all those elements early on, but you need to design for leaving room for them to be later on. If you don't have those features, for example, you can have a game which doesn't feature guilds yet, or some sort, or teams, or whatever. If for some reason, like the structural reasons of your game, or people coming from other places, maybe they will expect to have some sort of thing and to have some groups and community. And that is like the long-term gameplay that you need to have. And you don't need to, I mean, you wouldn't want to have a design that forbids to have that thing later on.
And that's why, in kind of the way I approach it, and I think similar people have different ways of doing it, but as other people deal with it. For me, it's I break it into three layers of gameplay. Onion like core central part being the mechanic, the middle part being what I call the context loop. Some people call it the meta game, but for me, that's the context. So that's the sense of purpose, progression, optimization, and narrative payoff. That narrative doesn't necessarily have to be literal narrative. It can be, it can be story, but it can also be like my sense of identity in the game. But then I also then have an outer layer. For me, that's the sort of cultural layer. But even in that, I'm looking at the lifestyle fit as part of that process. So, does this game mean it fits really well with me sitting on the phone on the toilet while I'm doing distraction? Or does this game fit better in a window where I'm taking time out of my world and dedicating myself surrounded by multiple screens with my PC? Those things have a different impact on the way I approach the game, but so does cooperation and collaboration with other people. So does that sort of zeitgeist thing, which means, for me, what I mean by zeitgeist is how other people would be willing to watch someone else play. That visual, that sense of connection, the sense of, it's interesting to watch, for me, is part of this kind of wider cultural connection. Given the principle, given that principle, I actually have a view where you kind of try and think about a different audience persona for each of those layers. Not because I want to separate them out, not because the person you're thinking about focusing your cultural design is not somebody who also has to play, but because I'm trying to scale the range of people who might be interested in that game. So do you have any, we talked about the player and understand the player, but what approaches do you take when you're trying to understand this game, which you've now got a premise for, and its audience? How do you look at that?
Well, sometimes it's tricky because there's this pervasive use of personas in terms of demographic elements.
Yeah.
And for me, they're usually useless. Because
I like that, but I do understand where you're coming from. Exactly where you're coming from.
But I mean, sometimes they can be kind of useful from a marketing perspective or from a go-to-market perspective. Like, you can design marketing strategies around demographics, mostly because the channels that you use for marketing are constrained demographically. So you can build personas with that. But for design purposes, they're not necessarily useful. And sometimes I like to have them be in terms of related to intrinsic motivation of why you play something. And there are a lot of game design frameworks in which you can try to make these personas. For example, like the 4 types of Bartle it's a socializer, the explorer, the achiever, and the killer. Which he later on said that only applies to mods, doesn't apply to everything, but we still use them because it's just like it's a nice it's a good first lens to apply to something. But for example, you can also have, I think it's called flex, an emotional motivation to play something. Like, for example, you want to particularly experience or feel a specific thing while playing this thing. And I like to into particular emotions when related to design elements. I like to have like 3 design pillars in terms of emotion. So you can have different personas that you could define as how they're going to experience those emotions. So, for example, if you have again, just thinking with it ruggedly, you can say, well, if it's about football and cars and you want to move fast, there needs to be some sense of speed. So you could say, okay, you need to have a feeling of speed or more like a quickness of sorts, that you could react to things very quickly. On the other hand, since it's very the premise itself is very playful and you would like to try something that seems wacky because of the premise, you could say that another emotional pillar will be whimsiness or feelings of whimsical, playful things. So you could say whimsy, playful, something like that. So you want to be kind of a fool around this thing. And then you have those things are related to, for example, maybe the core part of the gameplay. But later on, when you start to engage in the skills that you need to have, you could have another feeling about mastery or exploring the mastery of becoming good on the game. So, for example, you could design these personas that and even in the beginning, some people could see very quickly that you can easily play the game, but then later on you can become really good at it, and they are going to be motivated by those factors. And you try to say, okay, what if I have a person that is 80% interest in speed and 20% interested in win and 0% interest in the mastery. So it's kind of a casual player.
You can draw a lovely spider diagram of like where you think the strengths and weaknesses of those things could be.
So those motivations of why you want to like to play the game, regardless of your demographics, I think are much useful in terms of design and to characterize the user experience along the game.
I think that's very sensible. So I do happen to like the demographic thing, but then as a trained marketeer, you'd kind of expect me to. I mean, it's kind of inevitable I'm going to. But I like it because I want to identify that not only am I identifying an audience, but I know how to target them. I think being able to target the audiences that we're going to. But again, like you said earlier, it's a hypothesis. It's a mind game, experiment to kind of a thought experiment to work out what sort of things are we trying to make? But I really like the way you talked about the different personality types, whether you're following Bartles types or something like Quandric Foundry. I think Newzoo's done some, Game Refinery did some. There's a bunch of them out there that are perfectly reasonable tools. But I particularly like the way you took that next, where you looked at intrinsic motivation. And I think essentially for me, I'm interested in the kind of core motivation directions. For example, is it about collecting? Is it about completing? Is it about expression? These kind of factors. In fact, I think control is an interesting one. So the fact that I control something, that sense of escape, to me is an intrinsic motivator, and actually more akin to one of the explanations why, bear with me, but the reason why women tend to still be smoking more than men is allegedly because, according to the research that I've read, because it is something that they control. Even if they know it's bad for them, it's their choice. And again, I think it's really interesting in the cultural context to understand motivation and how we can then apply our understanding of motivation to this. And I think that's one of the reasons maybe why particularly the match for these kind of repetitive style gameplays becomes a replacement for the cigarette break for a lot of people. Because again, it gives me that sense of control that it's my time I'm spending investing in me. Does that make sense?
My particular hypothesis for that I developed in the last few years, in which I really got into watching speedrunners on Twitch. And when I try to explain speedrunning to other people, the way I say it is that it's meditation aided by gameplay.
I was saying this about how I play Polytopia. To me, Polytopia is almost meditative.
Because when you try to explain meditation to other people, you say you're trying to suppress other thoughts by focusing on something, and it's like it's kind of messy. Like the way to disconnect of everything else is to connect really hard with something. And games, when you are comfortable playing them over and over, if you're, for example, a Mega Man speedrunner and you like the game so much and you feel comfortable playing it, and you can say, okay, I want to really shut the world down and really focus on this thing. I think a lot of puzzle games, match 3 games, allows you to have that kind of thing in which, okay, this is rewarding. This has like a nice UI and the sound and the experience and the elements of progression through the levels. So this is something I can really connect hard with it and shut the world off for a minute. And I think, for example, maybe the control experience, the cigarette break, can also feel similar to some people, like in which, okay, I can really connect with this narcotic feeling of having the smoke and to really focus on this thing to be here and now and shut everything else. And I think that I wanted to touch a point with what you mentioned earlier about the lifestyle thing, because I think in terms of monetization, when we're talking the thing that brings us here, I do think that it is important to have lifestyle considerations, how your game is going to become a hobby for people, because you can have all kinds of, let's say, low-hanging monetization fruit early on for people in the early parts of the game. But if your game should become sustainable in the future, you need to have a long-term strategy for monetization. And the only way to do that is, okay, your game needs to become a hobby for the people that you're going to have playing the game. So if you're going to become a hobby, you need to be affordable in terms of time and experience. So that is very, very important, because, for example, sometimes you can have some monetization elements that, and this was especially difficult to explain back in the day when I was doing really heavy monetization consultation 10 years ago. You need to have some things that will make people say, okay, have a little bit more room or freedom to play the game, so it's more affordable to me, because I don't have enough time, but I can have like a dedicated 1-hour session every day, but that's late at night. I can't have 3 different sessions of 20 minutes like your regular person every day. So for example, you could say, okay, you have, for example, tickets to play like a particular session, like hearts or whatever. You could say, okay, you can store at maximum 3 hearts, but with your one-time monetization payoff, you can say, pay this particular amount of money and you can store up to 5 hearts. So
I think at the heart, what you're describing to me is understanding the value, the utility, the benefit that the players want, and making sure that whatever your game design experience, your monetization experience is aligned with that player desire.
Yeah.
Rather than kind of the exploitative. Again, I think it's also worth mentioning, I think we're not talking about creating addictive in the kind of medical sense games. We're talking about addicting in the delightful, engaging sense of the word. I think there's been a lot of confusion being laid around particularly with the inclusion of gaming disorder in the I think it's in the Digital Statistical Manual 6, referring to a form of behavioral addiction that is being facilitated through the method of gameplay.
Yeah.
Which to me is no different from any other behavioral addiction, which is an underlying issue. We're not trying to create games that are addictive in the sense that are overly facilitating that disorder. We're not trying to create that at all. Quite the opposite. We're trying to create delight, enchantment, expectation, and emotional engagement with the content. Does that make sense?
And also, of course, I mean, I think it was all wrong to talk about addiction because I think it was like a foolish attempt from some parts of the marketing gaming community to say this is really a powerful connection of sorts.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why I like more the framing about being a hobby and something that you feel so enthralled about it that you really want to engage with it. For example, I really like Emily Greer's talks in GDC when she dispels all these myths about monetization and why can a person spends like $5,000 on a particular game. It's like you wouldn't judge someone that, I don't know, collects margarine little cars for spending $5,000 or even like $1,000 on a particular collectible kind of thing. So why would you do that with someone that does the same thing on a digital product?
No,
maybe we wouldn't.
Well, exactly. But I gave a talk in 2015 at GDC talking exactly about this issue. And I had a professional game psychologist support me in producing the materials for that talk, where we actually broke down some of the kind of key factors. And if you listen to CEO Larian earlier on in the year talking about the kind of games that are going to continue to be successful in the future, being ethically balanced and delightful focused, absolutely critical. That was a part of what I was talking about back in 2015. And a lot of the issues that people are talking about now that have been expressed, to me, feel a little, I don't know, I don't want to say disingenuous, because I think there are genuine issues where there are people who have underlying problems and their expression of those problems through games is detrimental to their health. Absolutely agree. That happens. No question about that. But that's, to me, why it's our responsibility, like you said, to focus on our games as hobbies, as things that fit with their lifestyle needs, fit with their engagement needs, and give them the opportunity for the two things that can avoid underlying issues. First thing being the ability to break out. So natural moments of play where I can stop and look forward to coming back when I can, but I don't feel like I'm being held back from breaking free. And the second one was transparency. So a lot of the issues we see people complaining about with things like loot crates and so on and so forth, we could have dealt with if we had an honest conversation about transparent communication with our player. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, you get my point. Yeah.
Yeah, but the point I was trying to make earlier about these elements of monetization that will be needed for the game to become more affordable in terms of lifestyle choices.
Yeah.
In particular, for example, to the sessions, you can design around any kind of personas the particular sessions that you will like them to have the engagement that you will want in the game. But that is always a premise with which you start and not necessarily how it will actually turn out. And then when you have a particular audience and you want to optimize for it, this could change. And you need to have elements for people to hopefully adapt the game to their lifestyle because it's how you would like it to be for it to be successful. And sometimes some of these elements of monetization are considered by some very hardcore game designers as cheats or buffers of you're going to become this is a slippery slope of a pay to win game. So for example, you could easily say, okay, we have like 3 elements of monetization, like things that are cosmetic, things that are related to some sort of advantage or on the game, and others that are more like a lifestyle affordance for the game. And sometimes people confuse the lifestyle affordance kind of elements of monetization with the ones that are related to a particular edge and advantage that you could, for example, purchase with soft currency or something like that. So it really becomes tricky because it's all about the discussion of how people are going to play the game, and particularly what are the possible optimal ways to play the game. Because no matter what you do, if your game is really whimsical or really light or whatever, you will always get people that are going to land in your game for whatever reason, and they will they will want to try to break it down. That always happens. So you need to have some safeguards for those people.
Yeah. And like I say, I've got no problem with there being items for sale which have some level of advantage. To your point, I do have a problem when that breaks the game. So I don't actually think there's such a thing as play to win. I think what you've done is broken your game if you've done it badly.
Exactly.
But there's so many different ways of doing it. And one of the biggest things that for me are about making sure that you're applying the scissor paper stone principle, because if you only have one vector, everything is a +1, then there's no nuance, there's no dilemma, there's no stress, there's no question, there's no choice. It's just a raw number, and I think that's pointless.
It's boring.
It's boring. Whereas if you introduce an idea of something which provides a compromise, I can have that +5 score, but it's slower. Now I've introduced a dilemma. I've introduced gameplay, and isn't that what we're here for anyway?
That's absolutely true. But coming back to the point, something that was difficult to do back then, was to have that thing. Because, for example, another interesting thing that I've seen with people engaging on economy design nowadays is that since in the last, I don't know, 10, 12, 15 years, there has been an evolution of people that work on these things. There are different understandings. I mean, back then, if you would say what is a free-to-play game, some people were really puzzled by it, and it's like, so you play those Korean MMOs that are really, people play MapleStory and stuff like that.
I learned so much from Korean MMOs. I mean, actually, the thing that really taught me the most was probably MapleStory.
MapleStory, absolutely.
Back in the day, magical. I mean, it was very cosmetic led. But I think it introduced the world to a whole bunch of principles around free to play.
Or for example, this is a really old one, but Puzzle Pirates. Did you play that?
Puzzle Pirates.
Puzzle Pirates. I mean, it was very, very limited technically, but in terms of design, it was really beautifully designed. And the thing is that those were kind of niche games and stuff like that, and you were trying to break something new, and sometimes you will have some references with games on mobile. And for example, 2012, 11, you will have, for example, your DNA games. It was one of the biggest back then. So people will say, but these are like collectible card games. I can see that, but what if you have like a more PC kind of game? How are you going to do it? But now, 10 years later, it's like nobody is unfamiliar. I mean, if you're trying to work in games, nobody's unfamiliar with Fortnite, League of Legends, Rocket League, all kinds of really big kinds of games. And people are familiar usually from a more experienced point of view. It's like they actually have played these things, and they see that they work, and they can have all the things that you will want. And now the challenges are not about how we're going to make this monetization model work, but actually more about the particular intricacies or the problems of, okay, how we're going to differentiate from this other thing. And it's not a game design or economy conversation anymore. You could say there are some best practices that you could follow, and more about how we're going to make these things stand out from these other games. So that's something really refreshing to have seen from some recent conversations with some people that work on current games and and current game design monetization. And now there are like other challenges more related to the particular formats or the gameplay that you could have. For example, there are really interesting challenges in how you can have this, how they call it, hybrid casual kind of thing.
Yeah, hybrid casual.
Hybrid casual, yeah, like or because you had like the hyper casual, and then you would like to make it less hyper and maybe a little bit more into mid-core game, and how you make it a transition. Or some people talking about making an hyper casual game that within the game experience becomes more like it can become like a 4X game in later on.
Yeah.
So those are really interesting design challenges that you will have nowadays that have nothing to do with the basics of game design and economy, which is refreshing from everyone.
So we talked a lot about kind of like thinking about what does the game have to be and how we identify the structures and approaches. And I particularly like to make sure we think about what success looks like. I think you've highlighted some of those elements. Now we've got the design locked down. We've worked out what the motivations are, the intrinsic motivations of what we're trying to get players to do. What's the biggest transition in terms of your perspective as a product owner going from getting the game ready to launch and then to live? How does that kind of change, or what does that do to you as a product owner? What your changing objectives during those periods?
Yeah. Well, I think there are mainly two pillars. One is purely related to execution. Like sometimes you need to have some sort of priority or pillars of how things should be in your product, in your game, because sometimes in the details of execution and also in the pressure that you get to launch something, you can lose sight of, okay, this is a barrier we should not cross. Because people, another thing that I really think made a lot of damage in tech in general is the premise of move fast and break things. It's become
good in that, but
absolutely, it's been absolutely harmful, because it's like, okay, I get it. You need to move fast and sometimes break some things, but you don't want to break all the things. Or maybe there are some things you should absolutely not break, because the cost of undoing that harm is way worse. And so that's one thing, like being very mindful and aware, okay, this is a barrier we should not cross, because the harm that it will cause is greater than any potential benefit of doing it faster. And the other consideration, I think, is a lot about expectation management. Mainly because usually you could have a design that is sensible around some industry-vetted benchmarks of, okay, the early on the experience is going to be like this, and we're going to aim for this distribution of engagement and retention, for example, session length, number of sessions, whatever. But sometimes the expectations of the people working on the game can be very wild on one particular metric. And it's usually because of some political reason, because, I don't know, the VC they somehow convinced the VC that they're going to have 60% day one retention on the first month of launch. And it's like, I'm sorry, man. I mean, unless you have some really powerful reason or narcotics coming out of the game, that's not going to happen.
It's just, very, very. No, I totally with that. I mean, the way I kind of look at it as a product owner, it's my job to be the protector of the player experience as much as it is the protector of the bottom line of the game. And so that does put you in that difficult position where you're the one who's got to decide. Often you're the one who has to decide what you can break and what you can't break. And that's a tough position to be in those circumstances. What do you use to help you drive the decision about what is the thing to go push versus not?
Well, it kind of depends, because I think that one of the key constraints of how hard you should push things is, okay, you can have a particular aim of how high you would like to have your metrics, but it's not going to be necessarily like that in the beginning. And the question is, how much time do you have to make that, to gap that bridge? Because, for example, let's say you're still reasonable and you say, okay, I want to have, a 10% day one retention. And you say, I'm fine not getting it right away, but it's a really big difference to say, okay, can you sustain the game for 3 months to get to that benchmark, or 6 months or a year? So that really compresses everything. So, for example, for me, more than adjusting what would be something that, okay, this is what we should aim first, I need to have the constraints first to say, okay, it's not about what we should prioritize, is what are the particular restrictions that we may have to actually achieve whatever we want. So it's a really different landscape to say we need to bridge this gap in 3 months versus we can bridge it in a year. Because, for example, in a year, you could say if we can add some more content to the game that can help us bridge this gap, we may have time to develop for it. But if you have only 3 months, it's like you will not have enough time to make content for it. So you need to have this even worse. You need to have a design that will allow itself to be optimized early on to allow you to do that.
That's why I love putting the config straight into a server or a JSON file that's independent from the build, so I can make changes and keep going really quickly.
The client has to be a dummy client. Everything has to be server side because the particular goal of how we're going to do it is very important. And also this conversation, this was another really tricky thing to do back then. And sometimes it's still tricky to do with teams that have not experienced launching a thing and then trying to optimize for it, which is we need to have a conversation today about how we're going to sustain the game from the first 3, 6, 12 months when we design the game, because we need to have a game designed for it to be optimized with the time we have to reach the targets. Because it's very different. It's very different games, and sometimes there is a mismatch between the design of the game that doesn't take into consideration these optimization scenarios that you would like to have later on with the game in which you actually do. And sometimes people are not accustomed or they don't see the value to engaging seriously in this conversation early on, and you need to kind of paint the whole picture of the life cycle of the game and to bring it down and hone it close to home to say, okay, this is the reason why we're having this discussion today, because later on we won't have time to more than react and to do things very fast. So that's another critical component.
This is why it's probably the most common thing I get into in a conversation with people is, you need to put this on the server side. Oh, but we haven't got it ready right now. But every time you do any change to the game, you're losing that time because you're going to have to undo it all again.
Exactly.
So you're just wasting so much time and resources, and it's compound interest costs because every time you do an update, every time you do it, you're making it harder and harder to unpick.
And that's probably because we fell under the spell of moving fast and break things. I like to copy this from another friend that said, you need to move slow because slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
Yeah. We're going to be like water.
Exactly. Be like water, my friend.
Be like water. Has to be done. So I think the other point you were making earlier was about setting expectations. I think is incredibly important factor of that, that product owner role. And it's not like the games industry ever had people who said that their game would do 15 million things that it couldn't possibly do early.
Yeah.
Wait. I was a bit of a victim of that because of when I came into PlayStation Home, Phil Harrison had already said 2 years earlier that PlayStation Home as a virtual world we had all these things, but we were never allowed to do them like a trophy room. We could never do a trophy room because a trophy room requires 3D models, which required all the game developers to build the 3D models that Sony didn't mandate the game developers build the 3D models. So we could never do it. So,
but that later became Avac in Life.
Yes, well, Avac in Life, but also, there's Atom Universe existed. But more interesting for me personally was the number of people who were trying to rebuild the game from binaries. I had a whole bunch of Discord groups. In fact, somebody had actually launched on PC, not for profit, but a version of PlayStation Home built from the old binaries, which Sony did not shut down. So I was very happy about that. Anyway, the point though being is that actually I think this takes us into the sort of live part, and I think it's an important part of live, because I think there's a point where once you have gone live and then you start running in scale, then what's happening is you're essentially handing over ownership of the game to the players, arguably, or to the community to some extent. Does that make sense to you? I think that I think my responsibility then is to the community as much as
Yeah.
it is to the bottom line. But communities are notoriously great at telling what they like and terrible at telling what you should do, is in my
Yeah.
opinion. How do you feel about that kind of how much of the game becomes the players?
Well, it depends on the particular expectations that you have about the game, because it's very different if you want to have a game that becomes larger of sorts, because
Yeah.
you're making the game grow in terms of features or content or whatever. Or if you say, okay, this game has become large enough for it to be just sustained for whatever
Mm,
time we have. So, for example, the analogy I like to make with that one is in terms of a theme park. It's like
mm,
any game, any live game, it's a little bit like a theme park. And when you start making the game, you say, okay, are we going to make the theme park big enough? And we need to invest on improving the existing games or adding more games to the theme park. Or are we sustaining the theme park? So we need to keep
mm,
it clean. We need to give some variety. We need to have some events for people to say there is a reason for us to come to the theme park.
yeah.
And how much of a governance you leave to the players around that thing, how you properly set up tools for it to be cheap enough to run and stuff like that. So usually the part of, okay, we're just going to sustain this thing. It hasn't been something that I experienced with many games, because I have worked mostly on either pre-launch or launching and trying to make it grow. And I have been in just a couple of games in which you're kind of gardening the game out. And so the particulars of what are the relevant elements or tools for that thing are more related to make the game in the earlier stages a little bit more suitable to actually reach that stage. So, for example, some of the things that you will not invest in terms of tools early on, because you don't know if you're going to just cancel the game or it's going to become sustainable. Sometimes you just don't do them, but later on you can say, okay, maybe we should invest some time in doing this in a bit more optimal way, so we can have this thing left later on for live operations and be tool driven instead of having like engineers doing updates and changes every time. So some people are familiar with those things, and you can have a balanced discussion about it. But that is mainly it, like to bring the conversation about the sustaining part or the sunsetting potentially part, like to define what at which point this is becoming sustainable, because that is the other thing. Like, I've seen some games in which, because they didn't have the proper tooling, they couldn't have a sustaining part. It's like, you don't have the time now. You have grown for 2 years, or have tried to grow for 2 years. And because you didn't invest in the tooling, now to sustain the game is way more expensive than the game. But if you would have invested a little bit, maybe in the tooling, maybe you could have something that allows you to give you some sort of money every month, and you could sustain it for years. And I've seen many games close only for that particular reason, because they didn't become sustainable.
And often that wouldn't have been necessary had they taken the decision at the beginning to have an asset server, to have good data analytics, to have config-based settings on your server. Like you say, the thinner client approach. I'm not necessarily thinking completely dumb, client, but there's the right compromise for the game type.
Yeah.
I think doing that, the quicker you can do that, the more likely you are to set yourself up for success, particularly if we take this hypothesis-led model where we test and test and test as we go along and build basically the right game. So, I mean, just not that long left. So, in terms of the commercialization, what is the point as a product owner you're thinking about the commercial model of the game?
Well, it's mostly related to the monetization elements, because especially nowadays, if you have in-app purchases or ads or a mix of both, it can really constrain a lot what you're trying to do. For example, I have assisted a couple of game studios in developing prototypes of a game that they could hopefully make it work only with ads, but is designed in a way that if you could like to add in-app purchase later on, you could.
Yeah.
So that's something that has been very in the mind of some independent developers or some small studios, and that is, at least in the current landscape of games and monetization, something that is affordable. Or sometimes a game that is sustainable only with ads and that has like all the proper elements to grow into have in-app purchases. So you could, with the metrics of the performance of the game, justify the investment from a publisher to say, okay, we developed this thing, for example, I don't know, in a year we invested K, 100K in making the game, and we've been having the game live for 6 months, and these are the metrics we have. Can you, publisher, give us another 100K or 2K to invest a little in growing a little bit more the game, and also to have user acquisition for it. So it's a little bit tricky, because if you are a really powerful house of game making, you could even kind of flip the whole thing around to say, we're going to focus on what are the user acquisitions opportunities around which we can make new games. And then you have a stronger premise of how are you going to receive users and how are you going to purchase users, and then what kind of game we can make for them.
Well, you could argue a lot of the quote unquote fake trailers that became games literally came out of finding a user acquisition opportunity and then making that game. And then
exactly
going from there.
And that is something really interesting, because the biggest constraint is user acquisition and not necessarily game design, game development, and game iteration. So once you have a good premise of you're going to make this, or you're going to invest in this user acquisition strategy, then you can really ramp up everything else. But that's for houses that are big and can invest in that kind of thing. But for studios that are trying to do something of their own, from a commercial point of view, it's like something that is really tricky, because I had this discussion with some students in a local university the other day, in which they were asked to have a market study, a market research for their game. And the market research is in terms of, are there any indicators of having a market for that game? Like, are there other games that show proof of demand? They want proof of demand. And it's like, I think with the speed in which game development happens, and also the way the distribution of the market share for games happen, that is completely wrong. For example, the example I gave is like, if you want to have some sort of proof of demand for games nowadays, and you want to say, okay, I want to make a game about a little archer praying against some wolves and stuff, like, because there is a proof of demand with Arquero, then you can say that's pointless, because they're so big and they can swallow up all the demand for those particular games.
I refer to that as the elephant in the room when I talk about it. Because
so the question is,
taking up all the space.
Yeah, and nowadays, something really interesting that we have is that we have so much history of mobile games, especially. You could say that almost every genre and theme has been tried out, but they're not necessarily in vogue. So, for example, something that, I don't know, 7 years ago was crazy to say, was to say, let's make an endless runner game. Why? Because having Subway Surfers around made it pointless. But now everyone on Earth has played Subway Surfers, mostly.
At least 3 billion people, or
Exactly.
3 billion downloads or something. Yeah.
So you could say virtually everyone has tried it out, but people in general, they have tried that game. Some people are probably still playing that particular game. But you could say, hey, nobody has done a new Endless Runner game up until now. And maybe there is an opportunity. Like, I think there are stronger opportunities on genres and themes that have been kind of dried out because of old age or whatever, and that are not in the particular vision of bigger powerhouses making the really competitive games, because then you have an opportunity to make something that will, for example, be sustainable on its own. And an example that I gave people regularly is that there was these games, these idle games developed by a German studio, Colibri, that were later acquired by Ubisoft. So, for example, nobody was paying attention on the idle games at that particular moment. There were some idle games.
There were some great ones at the time. Yeah.
But they said, okay, why did we make something just very simple? And the difference, I think, is that some of the idle games that were available at the time had a little bit more gameplay layer. Like They were not really bare bones idle games. So they said, well, let's make a simpler one, and they got an audience. They made it grow, and then they became successful with that premise. It's like, what are some particular games that nobody's paying really hardcore attention? How can you make something different from what's out there? And is there a viable way to make it grow? That would be a stronger commercial approach for me nowadays.
In particular with those guys, I remember seeing them before it all became big, and I was saying to them, but what's the retention like? And then they told me the retention numbers, and I went, well, okay. I still haven't quite worked out why they had that. It was huge. It was great, amazing.
Yeah, but something that is not really much known about them in particular is that they invested heavily on the community side early on. Because when they started the games, they started forums and conversations and a lot of service with the players. And for some people, the novel factor was, why did we engage in a very lighthearted game in which we have a lot of things to say about it? And they were really responsive about it. So they somehow managed to have people that were saying, we're kind of co-developing a game with these people. And that is, I think, interesting in itself, and something quite under leveraged in general. And usually from a commercial point of view, you would not want to do that, or because of governance reasons, you would be afraid to do it. But they were just students, and they had kind of nothing to lose to do it. So
exactly. So, kind of summary, what's the sort of one thing you'd want somebody to take away from our conversation about kind of that product ownership style of function, what it means for the game design, the economy, and the management of the game?
I think something that could summarize the whole thing is to be mindful about the entire life cycle of the game, and to be aware of which elements of the later stages of the cycle you need to be mindful about when designing and making decisions, so you could eventually stumble across them in a more graceful way, so you could move smoothly among them. Yeah.
Totally agree. I think the life cycle of the game is described as a key factor.
Yeah, and under discussed in general, also in terms of conversations. I think even I have the experience of talking with developers that have several years of experience that have never even drawn the life cycle of the entire game, of any entire game in terms of a product before. So I think it's a discussion that is had in some way. And it's tricky because most of the design decisions that allow you to be quick in execution later on and to be really focused stem from having a clear overview of how the particular elements of lifecycle apply to your particular product and how it's dependent by it.
Thank you for that. That was fantastic. If people wanted to find you and talk further with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I think LinkedIn mostly.
LinkedIn seems the most common. Yeah. I mean, it used to be, we used to use a certain social media platform that seems to no longer be very popular, shall we say?
It used to be, but now, I'm also on the Blue Sky thing, but I haven't even posted yet. I've been quite busy, so. But now just LinkedIn.
I will make sure we put your LinkedIn in the show notes. Thank you, Raul. That's been fantastic. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
So this has been the podcast. We've been talking about the role of a product owner when we're looking at the game design and economy of a game, and the impact that has on our view of balancing and monetization design in general. So thank you very much to Raul for taking part in that. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, share. And on that note, thank you very much and goodbye.